Hello everyone. In this lesson we are going to learn and see an example of an Angular directive called ngFor. So let's first take a look at a generic example and then we'll look at an example specific to our application. So let's go to the profile component and let's create an array here because ngFor is usually used in list or array kind of data. So let's say we have a list here and it has some items like item 1, item 2 and item 3. Once we have these items, now we can go back to the HTML and we can here use interpolation to actually look at that list. And now if we go to the page, you will see that these item 1, item 2 and item 3 are appearing side by side. But what if we want to actually loop through them and we want to do something like similar for all of them? Those are the situation where ngFor directive is used for. So let's take a look at a syntax of ngFor directive. And it usually looks like this: star ngFor equals to, and then the keyword let, and then here we have a variable name, and then of, here we have the list, and then we can, for each of those item, we can do something here. So let's try that similar example in our case. So we can have a ul, which is for unordered list, and then we'll have a list item here, and for the list item we want to write it using the ngFor. So star ngFor and then let item of list. So that will give us each of the item in the list as the variable item, and now we can do interpolation on the item. And then it will look like this. So instead of printing all of them together, now it's going through each of them and then it's creating this li list item for each of them. Now let's try to do something like that for our application specific logic. Let's go to recent albums. And in recent albums, we're now calling get all albums and subscribing. And once we get the response, we are printing that. So let's take a look at that. So if we go to recent albums and if we go to console, see that got all albums. So we have 3 items here. So now if we want, we can loop through this item. Now each of these item is an object and they have this specific attribute: cover photo URL, created by, creation date, ID, title, etc. And we previously created an object with those attributes. So what we can do here is, in our recent album component, we can declare a class variable called albums, and then the data type for these will be array of album, and it's complaining about this data type, so we can import that. Now when we got this response is actually exactly same thing. It's an array of album. So what we can do is we can try to put that in this variable, this dot albums equals to response, and that will give a complaint that the object type is assignable to very few other types. Did you mean to use the any type? So which is mean is that by default in response we are getting an object, but by looking at the actual data we know that this is an array of albums. So in those scenario, what we can do is we can do a typecast using the data type, because we know what is inside, and then it will not complain about it. Now that we did that, we can actually try to print it from these dot albums and see if the data got assigned to that variable properly. Let's refresh that, and you can see that get all album response, and it's still showing those same data. That means the data got assigned correctly to that variable. So now we can actually try to print this data using the ngFor directive in our view, and you can see that each of them has a title, ID. Those are the attributes that are always filled up. So let's try those attributes. See, if we go to the listen album component, we can for now do a UL, and then inside that we can do an li, and in the li we can use the ngFor directive equals to, and then we can call this let album of albums. So albums is the variable that we have in the component, which is an array, and then we are going through each of those items and we are calling them album. And then once we did that, here we can use interpolation to print album. Now we know that album is a object and it has these attributes like ID, title, etc. So we can print those specific attributes. So ID, and then we can do album.title. And we see that the album is getting printed using the ngFor. The ID is getting printed here, and then the title is getting printed here. Now in our actual view, we probably want to see them in a little nicer way. So let's look for an example from Bootstrap to how we can print it in an show it in a nicer way. So we can look at an example of Bootstrap cards. And this is probably a card that we can use because this has an image, a title, and some other text, and also an hyperlink. Maybe we can use that to go to the actual album. So let's keep that in mind, and let's see what other example do we have, because we actually want to print multiple albums side by side. So for that, if we keep looking for example of a grid kind of example where we have like multiple of them side by side. So we found an example here. So let's copy that example and let's print that example, paste that example here and see how it looks. So it looks like this, and it's taking like as much space as it can get, and that's probably because here it declared as grid 6 of size 6. So maybe we can experiment with size 3 and see how it looks. So with 3 it looks nicer. That looks like a grid view, and we probably want to replace it with the image example. So let's go back to the image example. So we can use this example. So let's copy this and use this here instead. Card, and here as well. Let's see how it looks. So since the image is not there, it's not showing up, but otherwise the example looks reasonable. So the next thing we can do is we can try copying more example of that to see when there are many items, how does it look, because we want it to go to the next line once there are like enough items. So yes, so when we have many of them, it's going to the next line, and then if the page is smaller, that I assume it'll go even before that. So which is what we expected. It's taking it's not putting any space between them, so they are actually like very adjacent vertically. So we maybe want to put some space here, and we can use padding for that, as we have learned from our HTML example. So let's look for example of Bootstrap padding. Bootstrap padding. So the way Bootstrap padding used is the class name will look like this M or P, and then T for top, B for bottom, etc. So it will look like this: empty 0, margin top 0, margin top 1, like this. So in our case we want padding top, so it will be PT hyphen something. So let's try with padding top 3. And you can see that it put some nice padding here between these two. So that will work for us. So now that we got the example that's working for us, we know that with ngFor we don't need so many of them. We can just have one of them, and then we can loop through it to print it. So we'll just try that. So the way we can do it is we can put the ngFor here, and inside that we'll do let album of albums, and then that should repeat this internal div 3 times, and that's exactly what happened. And now in place of the card title, maybe we can put the album title. So we can use this album title in place of the card title. My album 1, my album, etc. And we don't have a description, so this paragraph we can remove. and then this will take us to the album. So go to album, and we would also like to show the image here. Let's see our image URL. So in the console we can look at the data, and we can see here that the image URL is called cover photo URL. So we can use that cover photo URL. So this image class source, so we can use the similar example that we used in profile, where we used for an image, we used this binding source, property binding. So we can use the same example here. So we'll use property binding, album dot cover photo URL. So now the images started showing up here. Now when someone clicks on it, we want them to go to the specific album, and then we actually have an example of doing something like that in our albums, that for going to a specific album, if someone clicks, that's the URL. So how do we go to a specific album? We can look at that example from my albums. So for going to a specific album, we need to use the router link /album and then the album ID. So we can use that approach here. So instead of ahref, it will be router link album /, but instead of this hard-coded value, this will be album.id. So that will take us to specific album. So let's look at that. So now we have my album, and then if we click on this, it is going to that specific album. And then if we click on this, it will go to that corresponding album ID. So that's how we have the examples of most recent albums. So we can clean up this previous UL example because it's working, and we can just use a h1 here for what this page is about, recent albums. Maybe h2 to make it a little bit smaller. And we have our album page, and we created that using the ngFor directive. Thank you.